It might be a good idea to pay attention this Sunday to the first reading from the book of Genesis, when God and Abraham make a covenant about the land which God is promising to Abraham. I always grew up thinking that a covenant was like a contract, but more romantic, because you had marriage covenants, and then we had all these scriptural covenants. And I remember one time in catechism class, we made like a mobile with all of the different covenants, a rainbow and the ark and all kinds of different things. But the sense was always that it was kind of a light contract. But I managed to study years later, and not everything I learned in theology has been helpful, but this would be something that I found very helpful, a better understanding of covenant. So in that Mesopotamian region, and Mesopotamia and Chaldea, we have historic records of covenants that were made. They were always made between warring nations. They're peace treaties, is what they are. And the problem with a peace treaty is always enforcement. While the army's there, you do whatever they say. But when the king moves his army away, then I don't really want to pay tribute anymore. I don't want to send my children to war anymore. I don't want to send baskets of grain anymore. And so the idea of a covenant was something of an enforcement mechanism, an encouragement on the agreement that was made for peace. So there's one covenant from, I think, Mesopotamia, in which they cut a dog in half. I know this is graphic. Probably YouTube is going to get mad at me, but that's okay. And they all, those who lost the war, all the generals and the king, walk through the entrails and say, "May it be done to me as was done to this dog, if I'm unfaithful to the promises that I make." Which is why, if you look in more sophisticated circles, you don't make covenants, you cut covenants. Covenants were cut. And that's what happens in Genesis today. God tells Abraham to bring a heifer and some other animals and some birds, right? And Abraham cuts them all in half. But there's something very, very different that we should recognize if we're paying attention. And that's that God doesn't make Abraham walk through the entrails of the animals and promise something. In this covenant, Abraham watches in a trance as God walks through the entrails of the animals and promises Abraham and his descendants. And this promise that God makes, this covenant that God has made with us, he has been faithful to. There's always the question of whether we're unfaithful, and all of the times throughout Israel's history and in my life that I've been unfaithful to God. But that's not where the covenant lies. The covenant lies in God's promise. God who swore, as he walked through the entrails, "May it be done to me as was done to these animals, if I'm not faithful." And God has been faithful. And in these Lenten days, even as we work to fine-tune our own response and overcome our own weaknesses and grow our own charity and connect better to God, even as we go about these Lenten practices, the church reminds us that the promise is God's, that the covenant is God's, and that God is faithful. And we do all of our work in these days to prepare ourselves for Jesus' passion, his death, his resurrection, for God's fidelity, for God who was cut as the animals were and sacrificed as the animals were, in order to overcome our infidelity and be true to his covenant. That the covenant is God's, and we are very blessed to have received such incredible promises from our God.
Volver a empezar.